Hello and welcome to the Gaggle where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a podcast on the ongoing diplomacy concerning the war in Ukraine. As you know, there's been a real extensive flurry of speculation during the past 2, 3 weeks about the President Trump's peace plan, whether this would be acceptable to the Russians, whether it was acceptable to the Ukrainians. And we've really had only the vaguest outlines of what President Trump intends. So even as I'm recording this podcast, President Trump's special emissary for all matters, Middle East, Ukraine, Iran, everything. It's Steve Witkoff is in Moscow, and so he's holding his fourth one-on-one meeting with Russian President Putin. Now, what has been quite remarkable about this diplomacy that's been taking place is, first, there seems to be a sense, at least the media are reporting the sense, that Russia may well be amenable to accepting the Trump peace plan, and that Ukraine, and more important, America's NATO allies, are absolutely dead set against it. And now Reuters has published two sets of documents. One document purports to be the peace plan as presented to both Russia and Ukraine by Steve Witkoff. And then there's the counter proposal, the counter peace plan. And it's appropriate to say counter peace plan because it's the very opposite of a peace plan, which is the one that has been presented jointly by Ukraine and its NATO European enablers. And that has obviously been handed over to the Americans. Now, the problem, as we'll see when we examine the documents, is that they are, to say the least, very, very far apart. There is no hope whatsoever that anything put forward by the Europeans and by Ukraine have the slightest prospect of being accepted by Moscow. Now, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has given obviously quite an extensive interview to CBS News's Face the Nation, which will be broadcast on Sunday. But CBS has posted some excerpts from it. And so let's take a look first at what Lavrov is saying about at least the American part of the peace plan. So here's the video, and let's just watch this.
I want to ask you about what President Trump said on Wednesday. The president of the United States says he thinks the U.S. and Russia have a deal. Let's get it done. Does President Putin agree?
Well, the president of the United States believes, and I think rightly so, that we are moving in the right direction. The statement by the president mentions a deal, and we are ready to reach a deal, but there are still some specific points, elements of this deal which need to be fine-tuned, and we are busy with this exact process. And the president of the United States did not spell out the elements of the deal, so it is not appropriate for me to do this.
But he did say there was a deal and that he was sending his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to meet with Vladimir Putin Friday in Russia. Is that meeting still happening? And should we expect a deal this week?
Well, you don't trust the word of the president of the United States?
I was asking your president's word. What will he tell the U.S. envoy?
We continue our contacts with the American side on the situation in Ukraine. there are several signs that we are moving in the right direction. First of all, because President Trump is probably the only leader on earth who recognized the need to address the root causes of this situation. When he said that it was a huge mistake to pull Ukraine into NATO, and this was a mistake by Biden administration, and he wants to rectify this.
Okay. As we can see here, this is the traditional, by now traditional Russian pose, which is that they're very, very positive, respectful towards the United States of Donald Trump. You're saying yes, there's a serious proposals. We're moving in the right direction. But obviously, there's still things that need to be sorted out. Now, the media have, during the past week or so, been publishing various leaked versions of the Witkoff-Trump plan. The key elements of which apparently are that NATO membership for Ukraine would be off the table, that the United States, and only the United States, would recognize Crimea de jure as an integral part of the Russian Federation, that the United States would recognize the territories that are now occupied militarily by Russia in Ukraine as de facto under Russian rule, and that so there'll be certain amount of territory exchanges, but that and then of course that there would be some prospect down the road of economic cooperation between the United States and Russia, including, very importantly, including the lifting of sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014. This was what has been written about in the media. So let's first of all now take a look at what Reuters, which leaks these documents today, the document that supposedly Steve Witkoff presented Ukraine, Russia, and NATO, and then we'll take a look at what the counter proposals are. So here is this is from Reuters. And a Ukraine peace deal proposal set out by U.S. at talks in Paris. And the text of the document is published in full with no changes. And then, so this says it was, the terms represent the final offer from the United States to both sides. So the ceasefire, there'll be a permanent ceasefire. Both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. And then Ukraine's security guarantee. So this says Ukraine receives a robust security guarantee. Okay, so what does that entail? Guarantor states will be an ad hoc grouping of European states plus willing non-European states. Now, of course, ad hoc is a real question. Which European states are we talking about? There's no way that Russia would accept the UK sending its forces, France, Germany, and the Benelux countries. But it's possible, even if they're NATO member states, it's possible that you could bring in some forces from NATO member states that are not too irksome for Russia. I mean, they could send in some Hungarian forces, would be acceptable. Maybe forces from Greece might be acceptable. Forces from Turkey might be acceptable. And then, of course, you might have non-NATO member states. You could have, Austria could send some forces. But, you can obviously, you have the non-European states. So, they could something could be managed there, as long as we're not talking about British, French, and German forces. I mean, that was obviously be off the table. Ukraine will not seek to join NATO, and then Ukraine may pursue EU membership. All right. And then says the territory. U.S. provides de jure recognition of Russian control of Crimea, and that was obviously something that has been spoken about, and Trump during his news conference, and then in some truths that he sent out, confirmed that this would be a matter. This is really, just for the United States. It would just be the United States. So Ukraine would not have to recognize Russian control of Crimea, nor would the Americans insist on anybody else recognizing this. And then U.S. provides de facto recognition of Russian control of Lugansk, and U.S. provides de facto recognition of Russian controlled parts of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson. So notice the distinction here, because Lugansk, mostly, it's about 98, 99% of the territory of Lugansk is under control of Russia. But in the case of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson, that's maybe about 70%. So the United States is saying, okay, we will recognize that 70% as basically under the jurisdiction of Russia. We don't recognize it, that Russia has a right to it, but it's effectively under Russian jurisdiction. But the rest, I mean, it's not going to say the 30% or so of those oblasts that are not under Russian control, then they're not going to recognize those as part of Russia. I mean, why should the United States do that? And then Ukraine regains the territory in Kharkov. That's also been speculated about. So that small amount of territory that Russia occupies will be returned to Ukraine. And then this is the curious part, which is Ukraine regains control of Zaporozhye nuclear power plant through U.S. control and administration of the plant, with electricity distributed to both sides, and also the Kharkovka Dam. It's now under Russian control. It's hard to see Russia agreeing to return to Ukraine, even if the Ukraine immediately hands it over to the United States. And there really is very little guarantee that anyone is going to keep his word on that this electricity would be provided to both sides. So almost certainly, in no time at all, and certainly after Trump leaves the scene, electricity will be cut off to the parts of the oblasts that are not under Ukraine control. So the notion that anyone's going to keep his word about providing electricity to both sides, I mean, is laughable. And then Ukraine enjoys unhindered passage on Dnieper River and control of the Kinburn Spit. So in other words, again, Russia would have to give up a certain amount of territory in Kherson to give Ukraine this access to the Dnieper River. And then we have the economic part of it, which is United States and Ukraine will implement economic cooperation and minerals agreement. Ukraine to be fully reconstructed and compensated financially. Sanctions on Russia resulting from this conflict since 2014 will be removed. U.S.-Russian economic cooperation on energy and other industrial sectors. Now, the sanctions that on Russia that would be removed would obviously only be the American sanctions. America obviously has no means of coercing the Europeans to waive their sanctions. And so therefore, although it suggests that sanctions will be removed and without actually specifying who sanctions, obviously it's only the American sanctions. And as to how Ukraine would be reconstructed and compensated is left vague, but it may be that's part of the cooperation and minerals agreement. So that's the Witkoff plan, and then here is the counter plan from the Ukraine and the Americans. So here's a Ukrainian and European peace deal counter proposals to U.S. at talks in London. Reuters has seen the text of a set of proposals on how to end Russia's war in Ukraine that were given to the U.S. on Wednesday. And then here's the text is published in full with no changes. And then here it is. So commit to a full and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land, and at sea. Okay, so that's in both documents. And then it says both sides immediately enter into negotiations on technical implementation with the participation of US and European countries. This is in parallel to preparation of the agenda and modalities for a full peace deal. And then ceasefire monitoring led by US and supported by third countries. That's more questionable whether actually the Russians would accept the ceasefire monitoring by an obviously partisan side, because after all, the United States and its NATO allies have been very heavily involved in this war. So therefore, you can't really have them a party to the conflict monitoring any kind of a ceasefire. So that's basically a non-starter. Russia must unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children. That's this is all a kind of a rhetorical flourish, because the Russians have already made clear that in all children, Ukrainian children that are living in Russia or under Russian sovereign control can return, as long as there are legitimate parents who want to see their children back. So as long as that, rather than just handing people over. So that's just not really much of an issue. Exchange of all prisoners of war. Russia must release all civilian prisoners. What and no obligations there on Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have to release anybody, other than prisoners of war. But what you mean? So Ukraine hasn't imprisoned anyone. That's and then the security guarantees for Ukraine. It says Ukraine receives robust security guarantees, including from the US Article 5-like agreement. Well, that's of course nonsense. That's an absolute nonsensical thing to insert into any kind of a peace document. I mean, the cause of this war was the push to insert Ukraine into NATO. It was absolutely right, and in fact, this is what Lavrov alluded to in that clip that we just played. That Trump understood this, and this is what Biden was doing. Biden was doing this throughout 2021, suggesting that Ukraine will be in NATO and that the door to NATO membership is open. This was said explicitly by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin in October of 2021, that the door is open, and that this clearly was the trigger for this war. So now to come up with this thing, security guarantees from the US, Article 5 like agreement, in other words, NATO membership in all but name, de facto NATO membership. There's no way in the world that that can be acceptable. And therefore, to insert this into this document means you are trying to sabotage. You're pretending that you're trying to put forward some kind of a peace agreement. But in fact, you are sabotaging it. There's no way in the world an Article 5 like agreement, which commits the United States and others, presumably UK and whoever, but the most important thing is the United States commits them to going to war on Ukraine's behalf, is NATO by any other name, and it's absolutely unacceptable to Russia. And it says, well, there is no consensus among allies on NATO membership. So that's kind of cutesy to say, okay, well, we'll have NATO membership, but we won't call it that because there's no consensus. Yeah, there's no consensus because if you were to put it to a vote among NATO members, of course, there'd be an awful lot of NATO members who will say no. So they're going to get around it by talking about security guarantees, Article 5 like agreements, which is in fact NATO membership once it goes to the United States, because it's only the United States. I mean, nobody cares if Luxembourg commits itself to going to war on Ukraine's behalf. All that matters is if the United States does so. And then it says no restrictions on the Ukrainian defense forces. Well, that's again, this is simply is a non-starter. This was part of the deal in Istanbul, which was that there would have to be quite severe restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces. And that was then. That was in 2022. It's very unlikely the Russians are going to give up more than 3 years later on something that they were insisting on back then. After all that the sacrifices and losses that Russia has sustained, that they're going to go back and abandon something that they were insisting on 3 years ago. I mean, that's obviously an absurdity. The guarantor states will be an ad hoc group of European countries and willing non-European countries. No restrictions on the presence, weapons, and operations of friendly foreign forces on the territory of Ukraine. Ludicrous, absolutely ridiculous. How can it possibly be acceptable to Russia that the presence, weapons, and operations of friendly foreign forces, so that British, French, German forces happily building military bases in Ukraine in preparation for the next round of fighting? Again, basically, it's just NATO. So in other words, you have the NATO guarantees along with NATO forces, NATO bases, NATO missiles, NATO aircraft. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. This is what the war has been about. And essentially, these Europeans are, despite the fact that this war has been, catastrophic to say the least for Ukraine, they're insisting on exactly the same things that they were insisting on in 2021 and early 2022, which led to this terrible war. Ukraine pursues accession to the EU. And then here were the territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. So in other words, basically nothing will be discussed, nothing will be resolved. The Europeans will just turn around and say, well, we don't accept anything. We're just, and therefore we're going to begin to arm and train and finance Ukraine to restart the war to get some of this territory back. Territorial negotiations start from the basis of the line of control. Again, no negotiations. They just say, we want it back. Ukraine regains control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with US involvement, and also the Kharkovka Dam. Notice here there's nothing about, providing electricity to both sides, which was in the Witkoff document. They just say, hey, you just give it that, hand over the nuclear power plant to Ukraine, and that's all there is to it. You're not going to get anything. And why would Russia want to do that? Ukraine enjoys unhindered passages on the Dnieper River and the control of the Kinbur. So again, they just repeat this from the Witkoff document, since it's generally favorable to Ukraine. So naturally, they insert it into this document. And then in the economics, U.S. and Ukraine implement economic cooperation minerals agreement. That's the same for the Witkoff document. Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. So they intend to keep it frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. And presumably they're going to continue to use those frozen assets as security for any loans that they provide to Ukraine. And presumably the interest on those frozen assets will continue to be handed over to Ukraine. Very unlikely the Russians are going to agree to that, to say the least. U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 may be subject to gradual easing after a sustainable peace is achieved and subject to resumption in the event of a breach of the peace agreement. None of that is in the Witkoff document. So they're presenting this at these Europeans and Ukrainians about American sanctions. They're actually telling the Americans what you can and can't do about your sanctions. The Americans did not say that there's going to be a snapback, nor did they say it'll be subject to gradual easing after a sustainable peace is achieved, whatever a sustainable peace means, and then subject to resumption. So in other words, basically, all you need to do is to provoke some kind of a conflict or other, some breach of the ceasefire, and lo and behold, the sanctions snap back. So as you can see here, this is what the Europeans are trying to do, is to sabotage the Trump-Witkoff peace proposals. Now, this becomes very, very hard to see how one can go forward here, because I believe that the Trump-Witkoff plan could serve as the basis for a deal to end this war. I know Russia would have to give some things up. They would have to give up some territory. It would certainly have to give up sovereignty over the entirety of this, the three oblasts, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. So they would have to make those sacrifices. However, the alternative, which is that the war continues, and in circumstances in which the Trump administration will blame Russia for the failure of its peace plan, and therefore will, as a result, redouble its efforts on behalf of Ukraine, redouble or triple whatever military assistance and financial assistance he's been providing to Ukraine. In other words, that the war just drags on with huge casualties, losses on both sides, without any successful outcome really on the horizon. And so that alternative, to me, seems very unattractive. I mean, if that, it would have been great if this could have been done 2-3 years ago. It hasn't been done. So now there's an administration in Washington that is ready to make quite drastic concessions. It's ready to accept that the goals that the Biden administration and the Europeans have been setting for 3 years were absurd, completely unrealizable, and need to be jettisoned. And they're ready to make quite major concessions to Russia. So that's why I think this would be a good opportunity just to bring it to an end. And then to start thinking about other things, maybe economic projects with the United States, and then a gradual thawing and improvement of relations with the West. That seems to me not bad. Now, of course, they'll be saying, "Oh, well, we can't trust the word of the West." That's true, but then if that's going to be your guiding principle, then there's no point in any negotiation. Why even bother to engage in any peace talks if your guiding principle is, well, you can't trust anything that the West say. So therefore, well, there's no point in talking. Then you might as well just continue fighting the war. And some will say, yeah, let's do it. Let's continue fighting the war. Okay. Is there a realistic prospect of this of Russia reaching a successful military outcome anytime soon? And by anytime soon, I'll say, okay, by December the 31st, 2025, is there a realistic prospect that Ukraine will collapse, Ukraine will be defeated and will be begging for mercy, and then Russia will just simply be able to impose whatever peace terms it likes? Well, I don't know. I haven't seen evidence that this is the case. I mean, so far as we watch, this war is just grinding on and on. Russia's making a certain amount of progress, but it's very slow. And given the rate of progress, then December 31st of this year seems unrealistic. It could happen, but it seems unrealistic that it's going to come to an end this year. So that's why, I'm sure there'll be people who disagree with me. I think that if we were to work within the parameters of the Trump-Witkoff plan, there is a basis here for, as we pointed out, there are things there that I think are unacceptable, like handing the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant back to Ukraine and then to the United States. I mean, that's off the table. But there are aspects there that I think are workable, and that's why I think Lavrov's comment that we are moving in the right direction is an indication that the Russians are taking this seriously. And this is the fourth meeting between Putin and Witkoff, so obviously something is up. They're negotiating about something. So I think that's doable. But on the part of the United States, they would just simply have to tell the Europeans, "That's it, we're out of here," because that's the only thing that's going to make any difference. As long as the Americans continue to involve the Europeans in this peace process, then as long as that happens, then there's no way there's going to be any peace. Absolutely no way. The Europeans are going to put in one obstacle after another, whether it's about the frozen assets, whether about the military bases, no restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces, the presence of NATO armed forces in Ukraine. I mean, they're going to just keep putting all sorts of things in there that will guarantee rejection of the plan, and therefore the war can continue, which is what they're really after. So we'll have to see, where this goes. I mean, here we have the American plan. It can't succeed unless the Americans essentially cut themselves off from the Europeans and cut themselves off from Zelensky. If they do that, then I think it's possible to get some sort of a deal. If not, if this whole NATO partnership talk prevails, then the war goes on, and then nothing is then likely to be achieved. And if anything, I think it's going to get even worse. So anyway, those are the thoughts for today. Thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.